Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Hey there, it's Brad. As someone who's passionate about podcasting, I've always thought there should be more support for physicians who want to share their stories and expertise. That's why we're launching Doctor Podcast Network.
We're bringing together a community of physician podcasters with one goal in mind: to provide the tools, connections, and resources you need to grow your show. So whether you've been podcasting for a while or maybe you're just starting, we've designed this network to support you every step of the way, and we're going to help each other rise, not compete.
If this sounds like something you benefit from, we'd love for you to join us as we get closer to launch. So you can sign up at drpodcastnetwork.co for early access. Stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. Really looking forward to what we can create together. Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
So we have someone I'm fanboying a little bit because I'm a big fan of his material, big fan of his podcast. We've got Derek Beres, who is a podcast host of the Conspirituality podcast. And he's a multifaceted author, speaker, podcaster based in Portland, Oregon, although he just admitted to me he's from Central Jersey. He's served in senior editorial positions at a number of tech companies and has years of experience in health science and music writing. He regularly speaks on science and media literacy. And like I said, he's the co-host of the Conspirituality podcast and founder of the nonprofit organization Cirrus Health. So, Derek, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Bradley. And yes, I did admit I'm from Central Jersey, but I think most Conspirituality listeners know that at this point.
So let's talk about first, what is conspirituality, right? Like, it's this portmanteau word of conspiracy and spirituality. So what do you mean by that?
I came across it in early 2020. It comes from an academic paper by Charlotte Ward and David Voas. As it turns out, Charlotte Ward ended up becoming a conspiracy theorist, but she coined the word to represent this recurring phenomenon of left-leaning, politically left-leaning, predominantly new age, predominantly feminine people, mindset, you could say, with right-wing politics. And it usually occurs during periods of social tumult. So, for example, in our book, we go back to the 19th century and identify different periods where this was happening. She references the mid to late 60s in her paper, when you had civil rights and feminism emerging and all of these really good progressive ideals being put forward. But then you had the John Birch Society and you had this return to traditional values going on. And so I found it in January of 2020. I wrote an article for a website I used to write for called Big Think. And then a couple months later, the pandemic is going on, and I asked two friends to start. I initially asked them to come onto my podcast, which was called Earthrise at the time. And then we just had a really good rapport, and the coverage area was around the anti-vax movement. And so I decided to just use that name because no one was using it. And that's where it all led from there. So we're almost 5 years into this project now.
And it's interesting that you describe it that way, that it's the confluence of left-leaning people with right-leaning politics, because traditionally the anti-vaccine movement were like these natural, clean eating, right? We talk about on the show how these are branding terms more than anything else, but self-identified people who didn't want these impurities in their body. And most of those people initially were left-leaning. And now what we're seeing is the anti-vax movement is like more of a far right. And it's interesting to see how these people who previously were left-leaning now find themselves on the other side of the political spectrum.
And a number of them will say they are still liberal or left-leaning. They will say that a common one is that the Democrats are the left of me, so I had to go here. But the reality, all three of us hosts will have different entry points for this. But my feeling is that the connective tissue is individualism. So while you do have politically, they seem liberal, what happens is there's a focus, and I'm sure you've covered this before, on individual health. The focus is that the individual is responsible for their own health. They will never talk about things like the social determinants of health. And then if you look back and you go back to Reagan's era, he was using the idea of bootstrapping your health, individual health, so that he could avoid implementing things like universal health care. So this intense myopic focus on the individual is common throughout them, and it transcends politics, although at the same time, it very much defines their politics.
And something that occurred to me with this last election was that the message of the Democrats seems to be, this is how and why you can help people that might not look or think like you. Like, these are people who, this is how you can help other people. And the Republican message is, this is how we're going to help you or someone you could possibly become. And that's where the Democrats may have lost the election, is that their message is, here's how you can help someone else. And the Republicans are, here's how we can help you, or make you think that we're going to help you. And that's how they get to that individualism. And that's the American way, this rugged individualism where I'm going to help myself. I'm going to work for me. And yeah, I think ultimately that's where we've lost our way. But that's a different podcast. That we're here to talk to physicians. So what I want to talk about is how this all integrates into the wellness movement. And it's important for physicians to know about this, because this is where a lot of our patients are going for their health information. And I also think it's important for physicians as community members interacting with your friends and colleagues who may or may not be physicians, and you're having these conversations and they're getting this information from these influencers to be able to push back in an informed way. And so knowing where a lot of these ideas fall short and like the emperor's new clothes, right? Like when you really expose them for what they are, they're really wearing nothing. I want us to be able to do that in a really informed way. And so to know the origin of this stuff, I think is going to be helpful. So I don't think we got into it yet, but why is it that conspiracy theories and spirituality end up making bedfellows? Like, how do these two overlap?
There's a lot of reasons. I'll start with anecdotally, which is that I have a degree in religion and I focused on Eastern religions, and that led to a yoga practice, and it led to me being a yoga instructor for 17 years. So I'm very much come from the wellness world. And I remember back in the 90s, even in brick and mortar yoga spaces, there was always a sentiment of, you can heal yourself. You're your own best doctor. Like, that language has been firmly embedded in wellness for a very long time. And that sort of contrarian ethos has carried across the generations, but it's been given steroids by social media. And so what you have is you have this sort of there's a long-standing strain of anti-intellectualism in America, but it's also fueled a lot by, for good reason, which is distrust of the healthcare system. And one thing I do a lot on the podcast is tease apart the fact that doctors, researchers, scientists, all doing amazing work. Tomorrow, we're having the largest healthcare strike in state history in Oregon, and I'm going to go cover it because Providence Health System, the hospital system, has been screwing its workers. And so there's that dynamic. And what happens in wellness is it all gets flattened so that any sort of institutionalized power and anyone that works for them, meaning doctors or nurses or hospitalists, are part of that system, and they put the onus of health back on the individual. But what happens over and over again in wellness world is they have something natural to sell you. And I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with the naturalistic fallacy. That is rampant in wellness, but it's also a key marketing technique. So just to go back briefly to, we don't want to get derailed by politics, and that I agree with that. But there is a lot of fear-mongering that happens with right-wing politics, and that also happens in wellness spaces where you should fear mold in your house. You should fear processed foods. There's a litany of things that you have to fear, and then they're always selling you the solution. So much, if a physician is wondering where that comes from, it usually, unfortunately, comes from a wellness influencer's marketing downline.
That also seems to be populism and fascist politics, right? Mm-hmm. This is who you need to fear, and I'm the only one who can fix it. So that tracks. That is like the identical through line. This is what you need to fear, and I can help you fix it.
We're also recording this during the wildfires in Los Angeles. I lived in LA for 11 years before moving to Portland. Many friends have lost homes that I've been in contact with. It's horrible. But what we're seeing on the networks, our wellness influencers are selling wildfire detoxes, homeopathic tinctures, ridiculous stuff. But that is happening right now. And they're just taking advantage of that fear and uncertainty that's happening culturally. And they're trying to make some money from it.
And they're also closing some gaps in healthcare because we know from 9/11 and lots of other places that inhaling these burning buildings and cars, right? This can have downstream impact on your health because we have to use the word, this stuff is toxic, right? But
actually toxic, yes.
Actually toxic, yes. Not pretend toxic, not spiritually toxic, but it's actually toxic. Now, can I help someone get this out of their system so that they don't have to worry about it down the line as a physician? No, I can't. You've already been exposed. It's in your mucosa. Like the damage is done, but they can pretend like they have the solution, and they can do that partially because we don't. And so they're capitalizing on our gaps in knowledge. And that's something that I hear you talk about on your show, is they pretend as if science thinks it knows everything and healthcare thinks that we know everything, and we don't, because we talk all the time about uncertainty. And we talk about this on the show, how to communicate uncertainty effectively. And they don't communicate uncertainty because they're certain about everything, including how you're going to be able to detox from the paint that you're inhaling with their homeopathic tincture. That is just beyond the pale, right? That they are taking this awful thing that's happening to these people, many of whom have no insurance on their homes because that's another institutional thing. The rug was pulled out from under them there, and they're capitalizing. They're selling their crap. Oh, that just...
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And that's one thing I have certain sort of heuristics that I work with in this field of misinformation, health misinformation specifically. But one of them is that honest healthcare practitioners will qualify all their statements with things like, this is the best we know right now. But wellness influencers don't do that. There's always an air of certainty around that, and it shows their scientific ignorance. But unfortunately, in the space of online networks where charisma is capital, they are able to capitalize on that.
On the individual level, I think physicians can leverage uncertainty if communicated in a certain way to garner trust. You can actually leverage uncertainty to build trust. But I think on the more individual level, when you've got a 10-second soundbite on the nightly news, it's really hard to make that come across.
Yes. I talked about coming from wellness, but I also want to flag that I worked in an emergency room for 2 years. I'm a cancer survivor. I lived in a hospital in 6th grade with a broken femur, and they treated it much differently then. So I have a deep respect for the healthcare system, and I know somewhat from the inside of what people go through in those situations. In those situations, most people will default to trusting medical experts. But when you're talking about online networks, it's an entirely different environment. Unfortunately, most people are on those networks as compared to when they need critical care or things like that. And there's the influence that happens that people won't seek care because of the distrust that has been fomented because of the influencers. So it's really challenging.
So you talked about the certainty. One of the ways that in the absence of science or data, these wellness influencers corral people to their cause, right? Because they can't use science or data, so they use certainty. But what are the other levers that they pull? What are the emotional levers that they use?
The emotional levers, it's the affect of care. For example, I had anxiety disorder for a long period of my life, and I had a lot of panic attacks, 2 of which put me in the hospital. And I didn't have answers. My physician at the time put me on Xanax, but I didn't really want to rely on that because I know dependence is possible. So I used it sparingly. So at that time, I had a yoga student who was a homeopathic doctor, and I didn't know much about homeopathy at the time. So I decided to book a session with him. He gave me a deep discount for his rates. And I remember I sat with him for 3 hours for our session. Now, the tinctures he ended up giving me, nothing worked because homeopathy doesn't work. But devoting 3 hours to listen to someone is unfortunately something, because of our insurance system, that most practitioners, actual healthcare practitioners, cannot afford to do. And so they're in this bind where wellness practitioners don't have that sort of patient load. And so they can very effectively put forward, both in real life, but also on the social networks. It's called pastel QAnon, was an early term that was coined during the pandemic, of the colors they use, the way that they speak, all of that. And that's very compelling to people who feel they haven't been served by the healthcare system, to see people who give the affective care. And to be clear, I think some of these people in wellness land actually do care. I don't want to write them all off as charlatans, but they don't have the scientific chops. But people are drawn in by the emotional aspects of what they put forward, and that's where they get a leg up.
I would think that most, if not, maybe not all, but most of them would care, because everyone needs to go to bed at night thinking that they're the hero, right? Nobody goes to sleep being like, I've tricked so many people today into giving me money, unless you've got like antisocial personality disorder. So I think most of them think that they're doing the right thing and genuinely helping their patients. It's just, unfortunately, they get mired in this world and you can't see your way out, right? Because you have to go to bed thinking you're the hero of the story. Once you get information that tells you that you might actually have been selling nonsense this whole time, it's really hard to swallow that pill.
Yes.
It's really hard to come back from that. So I think they are mostly decent people. They just happen to be wrong.
Yes, agreed. And there's also levels. Like, there's a difference between a naturopathic doctor who, although I think most of what they're doing is BS as well, they do actually go through some level of training, and depending on what state you're in, there are different credentials that are needed, as compared to a yoga instructor who is getting a percentage of a supplement they're trying to sell. And even though legally they're not allowed to make health claims, so many of them do. And so that category distinction is important as well. But social media flattens all of that so that you don't always know what level of practitioner you're talking to, because there are so many different online certification courses that don't actually mean anything, but they have an acronym attached to it. And people are just like, oh, they must know what they're talking about.
It's funny. Before I went to medical school, I was a personal trainer, and I got certified as a personal trainer. And most of the questions on the exam to be certified were about what you are legally and not legally allowed to do as a personal trainer. It was very little anatomy and physiology and biomechanics and kinesiology, and mostly, don't tell people about this. This is not within your scope of practice, and that's not within your scope of practice. It's really interesting. But yeah, it's certification. It's not some like legal designation, right? And it's also interesting the way, like you said, that homeopathic doctor spent 3 hours with you, right? Their income is generated very differently, because if I spend that much time, all I bill for is my time, right? Whether I'm in the operating room or in the office, I'm billing for my time. I don't sell stuff to people, right?
Yes.
But they do. So
Yes.
they can spend this 3 hours with you and earn your trust initially. And they don't have to spend that amount of time down the line. And yet you're still going to make the money because you're going to be continually buying stuff from them. So they have a different business model that really feeds into being able to use your time that way. And then you can accrue more and more people and such. But okay, so I think we're getting off the rails a little. I want to get your take on, why do you think health-related conspiracy theories gain traction in otherwise educated people in healthcare professions? My guess is that particular individual's lack of humility. That's my guess. You've got someone like Dr. Oz, right, who went down the rabbit hole and talked Garcinia Cambogia, right? That's going to cure everything. He had to testify before Congress because of the Dr. Oz effect, where he would make a claim and then sales of that thing would drive up. And now we've got, unfortunately, I'm an otolaryngologist. Now there's another almost fully trained otolaryngologist who's on the national stage making incorrect health claims. And I'm guessing some of this is, it doesn't matter how smart you are, that you can fall for conspiracies and misinformation. It's really the lack of humility that makes it more likely to happen. What's your thought on that?
I would say so. I think that's a big part of it. What I've noticed is these people don't know what they don't know. So you can also talk about someone like Andrew Huberman, who is a neuroscientist, but will consistently speak outside of his scope of practice. And to his very little credit, he does often qualify things by saying, I'm not an expert, but then he moves on, and he is such a charismatic
So does Joe Rogan.
frickin'.
Joe Rogan starts every spiel with that and then goes off the rails and whatever it is he's talking about. So don't listen to me. I'm just a comedian. But to my millions of followers, listen to this.
Yeah. And so what you said before, there's also a contrarian ethos that I think is built into the human experience, especially I'm almost 50. So the Gen X generation is very much anti-establishment. And so what you find with the rogue doctors
But we are the establishment. We were anti-establishment when we were listening to like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and going to Lollapalooza. But now we're like, I'm 45. We are the establishment.
But there are still people who want to feel that they're not. So specifically to the rogue doctors you're talking about, that is very appealing to them. But also, I've talked to a number of different doctors and researchers about this. And the general feeling is there's something like 2.5 million doctors in America between general practitioners and then specialists. And some people just feel compelled or pulled to stand out. And when you're one of 100 or 200 doctors in a hospital system, how are you going to do that? But if you have an opportunity via these online networks to be the one from inside the system, I'm going to guess I know who you were referencing on the national stage and her brother. What they're doing is they're like, we were inside this system, but we're going to tell you what's really going on. People outside of that system, that sounds really compelling. It feels like they have some insider knowledge. They're being given something that most people don't have access to. This is ancient. This is religion, right? This is the idea that I have this knowledge that other people don't have. And that's very compelling, which also fits into a lack of humility, because to have that sort of grandiosity, you can't really be a humble person.
I feel like that's the functional medicine movement as well.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I have this body of knowledge that mainstream medicine doesn't. That is Mark Hyman and his functional medicine movement to a T. I see the doctors in Facebook groups and posting with this arrogance about what doctors don't know, and they're there are functional urologists. Like, being a urologist isn't enough, right? And now you're a functional urologist. You're talking to people about nutrition. Fine, talk to me about how not to get kidney stones, but don't talk. You're like, so sorry.
I've seen that functional urologist and his wife. I've been on their feed. Mark Hyman, he sent out an email the other day, and I have to track all of these people. So I knew what it was. It was a sales funnel, but I took his 70-question questionnaire about health things. Like, how often do you feel depressed? And there was a rating scale, and some of them were very intimate. And I'm like, you're putting this online in a type form. And I knew at the end it was a sales funnel. So I took it once and I scored severe toxicity, which is not a thing. Like, it's not a thing. It is a thing, but it's not from that questionnaire. You can't actually define it. And then I went back and I took it again and I scored optimal health on purpose. And I was still shunted off into buying his 10-day detox program because I could still do better.
No matter what, you are buying something. You are leaving through the gift shop, my friend.
Hyman, the New York Times reported he made $28.8 million selling supplements last year. Like, it's an absurd amount, but he gets a lot of credibility out of the fact that he was a practicing physician. And it's all the networks you move within and the charisma that you have and the people that you know. And unfortunately, someone like Hyman knows a lot of people.
So we spoke earlier, I can't remember who is who, Callie and Casey, who's the otolaryngologist.
That's Casey.
So Casey went to Stanford, of course. Like, if we had to guess which program someone was going to come out of and then become this fringe health person, which one would it be? It's going to be Stanford, right? My thought is it's the proximity to the Silicon Valley and their prestige. So you have that lack of humility combined with proximity to people who like to build stuff and break stuff. So she's part of the MAHA movement, right? This Make America Healthy Again, which claims RFK Jr., they're going to make us healthy again by taking all this toxic stuff out of the food, right? But what I don't understand, and maybe they don't understand, is that they're trying to increase regulation in order to do that, right? You're not allowed to have this, that, or the other thing in food because it's making us all sick. So they've aligned themselves with the far right. And I think what people very quickly forgot was before RFK Jr. approached Trump, he approached Harris and she wouldn't take his call. Mm-hmm. It's not because he believes that he's the savior. He's just trying to get on board wherever he can. So he got on board with Trump, of course, because this guy might help him get some votes. So Trump will tell him whatever he wants to hear. And then RFK is all about regulation of the food supply with a party that espouses deregulation. how is that possibly going to jive?
Because ultimately, he'll be assuaged by the companies because what? You're going to remove a food dye, or you're going to influence some local municipalities to remove fluoride from the water. What RFK isn't talking about is the social determinants of health, and he never talks about universal health care. So he doesn't actually ever put forward anything that would make a substantial difference in America's health. The only two things that he has floated that the Republicans would shut down right away is ending direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals in America, which I agree with. That should be ended. And he also wants to end the pharma lobby, which is the biggest lobby in Washington, D.C. And historically, since 1996, Republicans have benefited more from the pharma lobby, although Democrats also benefit from that. So I don't think either party would end their cash cow in that sense. So those are the only two things that RFK says that Republicans would actually have a problem with. But if you float minor things like removing red dye 40 from it, companies will be fine with that sort of regulation because ultimately they're not actually taking away from their bottom line.
And I'll tell you what they'll do. They'll just add like an oxide group to it and change the name. They'll have their chemists on it so fast, and it was never going to do anything, but they'll be able to loophole this really easily. The same way, one of the parts of the Affordable Care Act was that health insurance companies weren't supposed to earn more than a certain percent per year of profit. Mm-hmm. And so the first year, people got checks back from their health insurance companies, and then the next year that evaporated because they just worked the numbers. These companies are really great at working these things. They're run by very smart people. So what you're saying is they'll have successes that will be in lip service only, not real successes, but they'll say what champions. And then because now Zuckerberg is also kowtowing to Trump, they control so much of the information flow. They can say, look, obesity's down, because they can just make up numbers and say whatever they want.
Absolutely. I'm reading a book called Calling Bullshit right now, which is about how to, part of it is about statistics and how to manipulate numbers to get the effect that you want. And that is all they will do. And something that's interesting about that specific thing, one colleague, not a colleague professionally of mine, but a podcast colleague, Dr. Andrea Love, has pointed out that when Maha was at the congressional panel with Ron Johnson, and they're saying, look at all of these food dyes that are banned in Europe that are legal in America, she just showed a chart. They have a different coding system in the EU. So what they're saying is illegal is just coded differently. It's the same exact product, and it's completely legal in the EU. And in fact, she showed how there are more, the US has more illegal food additives than the EU, but it creates this illusion because of the coding system. So the same thing is going to happen with numbers and statistics to make obesity magically go down. It's all going to be a marketing campaign.
One thing that they're really good at, marketing. So just to close out, is there anything else that you would want? You've got a captive audience of physicians. Is there anything else that you would want us to know about either conspirituality or how we can undermine the Maha movement?
That's a tough one. Undermining, playing on their playing field is something I think about often and try to do. And my nonprofit, Cyrus Health, that I founded recently, is my attempt to start to try to figure how to do that in media, because I've been working in journalism since 1993. I just can't imagine how hard it is to be a physician and to have patients come in and start telling you what's wrong with them and what they need prescribed. And I know this has been going on a long time, but from my understanding is it's only gotten worse in recent times. And so my basic heuristic that I've developed since the beginning of the podcast, this is more on the citizen side, not the physician side, but is watch what they say and then watch what they sell. So we'll go back to the wildfires. The wildfires are doing this to your body. I've got a supplement to sell you. The vaccines have done this to you. I have this tincture that will cleanse you of the vaccine, which is a very big thing in this world. And so trying to identify where they get their information from for your patients, if you can find the influencer, it creates so much more work on the physician side, I know, but you can at least see the narrative that's been created that led them to thinking that colloidal silver is something they should do to detox themselves. So I really appreciate all the work that doctors do, and I hope more people do, because it's a bit of a shit show.
Something that I did recently is I just asked a patient who was vaccine skeptic and all, and I said, listen, your problem is that they make money from these things, right? So you're saying that they're incentivized to fudge the numbers and do all these things so that they can make more money. But the person that you're getting your information to, like you said, watch what they say and watch what they sell. So what you're saying is there's a conflict of interest, that these companies are for profit, right? Okay. The person that you're getting this information from, are they selling something? So why are you holding this company to a different standard than you hold this individual? If you're going to be skeptical, try to be skeptical all around and hold everyone to the same standard. If they're all for profit, they're all for profit, and you should be equally skeptical of all of them. I don't know how helpful that's going to be, but it's my next. I try to iterate on things until I find something that sticks and doesn't alienate the patient. And maybe I'm onto something, I don't know.
I agree with you. The rebuttal will be, oh, but pharma makes so much more money than these influencers. They're making what, hundreds, thousands, millions in Hyman's case. Pharma makes billions. They don't understand that doctors don't make money for giving vaccines. They don't understand, or for most prescriptions. They don't understand because
vaccines are a money loser for pediatricians. It's a money loser.
Yeah. But influencers have, whether through their own ignorance or sometimes you have to account that some of them are just lying and know they are, they've created a narrative around how the medical system works. And again, differentiating between the C-suite and the actual practitioners, it just doesn't register in people's minds when they have their smiling influencer on social media who they feel they've parasocially bonded with, so they have some level of trust. So winning over that is the first step for any physician. And that for some people, it's wonderful. Again, like my wife, myself, we love our doctors, even though we are under a system at Providence that does not take care of its practitioners. But there is a growing number of people who are distrustful. So winning back that trust is going to be a challenge. And last thing I'll say, I remember talking to someone like Dr. Danielle Belardo, who's a cardiologist, about this, is that they don't get paid to do social media stuff, but some doctors have taken it upon themselves, like you, to say, let's talk about these issues to try to get more knowledge out there. And I think that's really helpful as well, because you can't only play in the field of the office when you're battling something like an RFK Jr. and the money that's behind him and the sort of media influence that's behind him. So the more that people can get ahead of it on social media, the more helpful it is.
And there are a lot of physicians out there like Dr. Belardo, who is really putting out a lot of great information. The Nadolsky brothers, who put out a lot of great information. There's a lot of great sources. Jen Gunter, a lot of great sources of knowledge. But as the individual physician, it's going to feel like you're spitting in the ocean. So what I would encourage you to do if you're going to put yourself out there on social media is first find your community. It should be a social experience. It should be a community experience. Find the people you want to follow and comment on their stuff rather than with no followers trying to just put your thoughts out there. That's a good place to start and a good place to get some followers and a good place to just establish yourself as a part of a community.
One piece of good news on that front is I know there was a strong medical community on Twitter, but politically we know what's happened there. But Blue Sky has a real budding medical community. And a lot of the people I know from Twitter and from Threads, you've mentioned a bunch of them, and then Rohit Francis in the UK, and people who are Ryan Marino, the toxicologist, they are very active on Blue Sky. And so it's not as vibrant as Twitter was, but it's being built there. So that's a good place to look.
And it's always good to be an early adopter. That is always helpful.
Yes.
So Threads, I was like, oh, Threads is great. And then Zuckerberg put out this post that they're not fact checking anymore. Okay. Derek Beres, Conspirituality podcast. Actually, I do want to ask you one more thing before you go.
Sure.
Because a lot of what you talk about on your show, it's really dark and it can be really depressing and overwhelming. So I want to end on a positive. What gives you hope?
I would say that when I was studying religion academically at Rutgers in the 90s, I am, to be frank, I'm an atheist, and it's because I studied religion. But the one that I took to the most was Buddhism. I am not a Buddhist, but the foundational principles of Buddhism are what drive me. And it frames my understanding of reality. And also between that and being a student of history, one entire row behind me right now in my library is history books, is understanding that we have been in worse situations than we are now before. Humanity has been in terrible situations before. And you have to be able to navigate the ups and the downs, which is foundational Buddhism, is trying to be as detached as possible from the circumstances while at the same time affecting change in the way that you can, like understanding what you can change and understanding what you cannot is a basic tenet. And so that's what gives me hope, and what drives me is that even though it is overwhelming, the sort of force that we're facing now with misinformation, over 5 years, we've built a business and have 500,000 people a month that listen to Conspirituality, and that we've made an impact between many of the people we've talked to in our lives. And so I focus more on the people who tell me that they were not vaccinating their children. Now they are, because they've listened to our podcast enough and listened to the experts we bring on, because us saying it isn't enough. We have to find experts in those fields. And that brings a piece of joy to me. I tune out what I can't change, and I just focus on those moments, and I keep working from those.
Sounds like you're managing your anxiety really well, because
Trying.
you're focusing on what you can change and shutting out what you can't, which is, I think, one of the big tenets of it. Amazing. That's really refreshing to hear, especially in someone who really spends a lot of time in some dark places. Derek Beres, thank you so much for your time. Everyone check out the Conspirituality podcast. There's so much to learn there, and see you next time.
Thank you, Bradley.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee, and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.